to this hybrid session of the summer school. Hopefully this will be a transition, and next year, 2024, we'll be able to hold a full in-person session. It's unfortunate that some of us could not make it, but still I'm glad to see that some of you did. And once again, welcome to the summer school, which is one of the flagship programs of the Agrarian South Network. And the roundtable with which we are starting is actually a very important roundtable. But we are not only going through a world capitalist crisis, but there's an all-round crisis of the world order, which has been dominated by capitalism for the last 4 to 5 centuries. And when capitalism finds itself in deep crisis, then it does its politics in another way, by means of war. And that is what we are witnessing. So I'm hoping that this session will help us to look deeper into what is going on in the world order, but also the reconfiguration, reordering of the world order that we are witnessing in front of our own eyes. So without wasting much time, because already 2020, let us start with the speakers today, and so as to allow maximum time for discussion, shall we say that each speaker should not take more than 15 minutes, hopefully less, so that we have enough time for discussion. So I'll start in the order that the names have been presented here. So shall I start with Praveen, please? Karibu, welcome, Praveen.
Thank you very much. And I'll try and sort of remain within that time limit. Otherwise, please do scold me as and when you find that I'm crossing that limit, Comrade Isa. Okay. All right. So crisis. Okay. All right. So hopefully we'll we have not discussed as yet amongst all the panelists, but hopefully we will touch on different themes. Let me start with some of the current focus on this whole discussion on crisis, etc. And in that too, I mean, as Isa mentioned, it's a kind of all-round crisis, etc. There are lots of issues there. So I'll just pick up 3, 4, and then let others reflect on what are the other very, very important concerns there. Okay, so the first obvious point, as everybody knows, capitalism evolves through crisis. So this is kind of ABCD of let's say Marxian political economy in particular, but political economy in general. Everybody knows it. And, so the evolution and resolution of capitalism is something through crisis and so on. So the question then is, what is new about this particular crisis? That really is the important kind of concern that we should be focusing on. Now, what I would suggest is that there is, in a very fundamental sense, nothing new in a systemic sort of sense for the last roughly half a century. A transition to what generally people call globalization or neoliberal globalization and so on. There are some key features, characteristic features, etc., which have been there and so on. But there have been shifts even within that. So if we look at, let's say, the crisis of 2007 to 9, the financial crisis and so on, that of course heightened a few things, gave it a new texture, color, and so on and so forth, right? And of course, on top of all that, then we had the pandemic, COVID, which really deepens the crisis in many ways. The basic point with respect to this particular issue that I'm flagging is that it has been a long crisis for the last roughly half a century or so, and at particular moments and junctures, sort of specific features and tendencies have shown in very powerful ways. So, for instance, as its roots in what was happening without COVID as a pandemic is an external talk about. So, as a I prefer to I like to use this report. Not use a lot of, UN report or sort of let's say dialogue because all this is then it's always I think it's this particular group, but in general, the masters of Rwanda. So IMF it is immense crisis the top of capital. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. All right. So basically, the new in economic terms, about the growth is down, inflation is up, people are down, hardship is up. Essentially, if we are looking at the most recent phase, we're talking of pandemic, of course, being the record in chief, so to say, but that needs to be contextualized. So, if you look at what has happened in the globe, there are different estimates from different institutions and so on. So, I will report again, barely 3 weeks ago. Yeah, it tells you that 22 million fewer jobs than pre-pandemic levels. The report from
Praveen, your voice is breaking. Praveen, your voice is breaking. You are a leftist, so keep your face to the left and speak in the microphone.
Okay. All right. So,
yeah, that's better.
If you look at the OECD and the G20 report, the estimates are approximately 200 million more people out of work. So, that is just before the pandemic. I mean, these numbers pertain to that. And it says that this sort of also has 75 young people, who have been out of work in addition to what the situation already was at that point in time, before the pandemic. So there are many other numbers floating there. So let me not get into more details about these. Developing countries in general, and of course, to a significant extent, developed countries. Basically, what we are being told is that it's an extremely challenging near-term outlook. So this crisis is not going to disappear. It's not going anywhere in the near future. And some of the core elements of it, in terms of markers of it, outcome-related indicators. Higher food, fertilizer, and energy prices, rising interest rates, credit spreads, currency depreciation, capital outflows. If you look at, the global community, in particular the global South, all these are very, very important indicators of it. And indeed, there has been a great divergence between the growth and the labor market trajectories, both in the developed and developing countries. I'll close my sort of conversation with some, basically focusing on that in about 5 minutes or so. UN reports tells you that 1.7 billion people in 107 economies have been severely exposed to at least one of these 3 channels, that is food, energy, and finance. Of these, 553 million were already poor and 215 million were already undernourished before the pandemic. So we are talking of sort of very severe kind of impact on approximately billion people in the world. Yeah, FAO's estimates that tells you that prices in the last year, yeah, were 34% higher than 1 year earlier, right? And according to them, it has been unprecedented. No, over 1 year, this kind of price rise. And now it's not very clear what is the time series that they're using, but at least in my memory, I can't think of any 2 years, yeah, where you have seen this kind of rise in prices. Fertilizer supplies have led to forecasts of crop yield reductions of up to 50% or so. United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and that has noted that there has been a very powerful historic correlation between increases in agri-food commodity prices and civil unrest. Some of those unrest we are already witnessing. As regards the debt question, which was being talked about in the earlier session in our conversation, yeah, UN notes that the global community is on the brink of a debt crisis, more serious than anything known earlier. So, in every which way, you can sort of, we are talking of standard economic outcomes, and everywhere you have serious challenges, and these challenges are far more serious in the global south than in the global north. What happened during pandemic, how that was handled, etc. I don't have time to get into that. But let me come to, okay, one more number. Some 70, according to UNCTAD report, and it has been endorsed by ILO, that some 77 million people, more people, are living in extreme poverty than in 2019. 117 million more people, all these are additional numbers, are experiencing hunger. And after a period of significant child labor is on increase. Right? So these few indicators we can appreciate. These are very standard indicators which tell you that things have become very bad, and as it happens, it is now not a consensus, but certainly a majority view that we certainly have not got out of the situation which was created during 2007 to 9 in any significant way. So we sort of, we are just moving from one, let's say, bad kind of episode to another worse episode, but basically, in an economic sense. Add to all this the crisis of the climate change, etc., where we are certainly not making any significant progress. Yes, so that was point one. That crisis on top of crisis. Yeah, World Bank, IMF, UN institutions, everybody sort of is on the same page. Now, what I want to really focus on in terms of another 2-3 minutes, I'll take just that. Essentially, the most important connector of well-being, either in terms of people's general well-being, but focusing more on economic well-being right now. This crisis of livelihood, crisis of employment. Right? By 1980s, everybody in the world, right to left, left to right, was talking of jobless growth. And just look at all those reports of 1980s, World Bank, IMF, ILO, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so that came to be a very, very important marker of where we had landed after the so-called golden age of capitalism during 1950s. Right? We don't have time to get into differences, details, etc. But this is something which possibly should rank among the most pressing kind of problem for the global community at large. Right? So, if you look at rates of labor absorption, okay, in country after country, what we are witnessing thing is that for, let's say, a given growth rate, labor absorption has been declining over the last roughly 4 decades or so. Yeah. Estimates from various institutions. Let me just give you some figures for India. During
one more minute, Praveen. Praveen,
Yes.
you have 1 more minute.
Okay, fine. So I'll conclude that. So if we look at, let's say, 1980s labor absorption, yeah, and growth rate, GDP growth rate. So roughly growth rate was about 5.5%, labor absorption 2%. 1990s, it came down to about 1%. There were last few years of 1990s, it actually was 0.6%. Yeah,
But you know
growth
what
rate
about
roughly the same, slightly higher.
That's way
If you look
before.
at most, if we look at the most recent years, for which we have the data, 14, 15, 15, 16, 16, 17, and so on, we have moved from job-less growth to job-loss growth. Okay, figures are in negative now. Even though you have, there's lots of debate on sort of growth estimations. Let me not get into that, but assuming the official figures for both, yeah, you are now in the negative territory, even if the growth rate has been roughly the same, yeah, compared to 1980s or 1990s, if you take those averages and so on and so forth. So this is something which is one of the most pressing and one of the most acute issues. And the final thing, which I'll flag and others can talk about it, I am completely convinced. I have been completely convinced for good more than 3 decades or so. So on that note,
Hello?
yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Thank you
very much, Chair. Yeah, so
Thank you, Praveen. Unfortunately, your voice was breaking, and towards the end, it was totally muted. But I think you have made your points with the figures and so on. And I think you're summing up that what we are witnessing now is from jobless to job loss growth is, I think, profoundly rounds up what is happening. And I hope that other speakers will take it up in terms of talk about the political crisis and the wars that we are witnessing everywhere. Now, without wasting time, let's go to Immanuel, please. Welcome. Please speak into the microphone.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you very much, Isa. I've read your book, can it be 50 years? No, 40 years ago, which I still consider to be one of the classics, Ujamaa villages in Tanzania. And I'd also like to thank everybody else who are here, but since time is limited, I want to just make a number of points. I may not touch on the war, but I may do so. I begin with the same point that Praveen makes, that this is the most significant challenge to neoliberal capitalism in 50 years, since the 1970s, the beginning of the 1970s. And so I think that it is on whole, number of fronts that this is taking place. Praveen made a number of points with respect to growth and the decline of growth and labor absorption rates, et cetera, declining. But I want to focus on what's happening in the global South and what has been, what I think is the final nail in the coffin for the neoliberal capitalist agenda. And in this way, I'm referring to what is going on in Davos, Switzerland right now with all these multinational corporations and multilateral agencies talking about the crisis and so forth. But there really is a crisis of the IMF, the World Bank, the multilateral organizations, and finance capital, as well as multinational corporations throughout the world. And they're very aware of it. And that crisis also has a history or a lineage that begins with, the end of the Second World War with overseas foreign assistance, foreign loans, foreign direct investment, and remittances as one after another development tool that the global North is trying to impose on the South, which in fact, during this whole process, they're extracting wealth from the South, very clearly in every one of these stages, from the late 1940s to the present. And, we can get into that, in the most recent example, what has been lauded so greatly is our remittances from foreign countries as a development model, replacing FDI, replacing foreign loans and overseas development assistance. And I just want to make a number of points, picking up on the work of Raul Delgado Ross, amongst others. It is a form of extreme exploitation. The form of remittances of migrant workers is primarily one in which low-wage migrant workers are moving from country to country. There is a lack of economic growth in the origin countries. There is growing inequality in the origin countries, focusing on rural workers as well, where land may be bought up by some maybe more successful migrant workers. And as we've seen in the last year or two, last 3-4 years, it's very unreliable. It's subject to financial crises within regions and countries. And it's also subject to the pandemic and COVID and so forth, which has left many workers high and dry and without any resources whatsoever, in which even mainstream migration thinkers are talking about wage theft, profound levels of wage theft of workers from Africa to South Asia to Southeast Asia. So I think that this is a very significant point that needs to be addressed. I also want to point out a significant factor, which I will in a few moments, that when we talk about a war, the second point, we also see punitive measures taking place. So from what last I read, 1/3 of the world is undergoing sanctions. There being economic sanctions of one kind or another are being applied by Western Europe and North America, which is a form of war. Sanctions are war, is a form of war. And it punishes countries in a very significant way, but it also has a blowback effect, which a number of scholars have spoken about. It also creates the possibility, which I think is a positive one, of multipolarity in a world. That's a very optimistic perspective, as there may be growing levels of competition amongst countries. So if we look at I'm going to go back to the 1970s again, which I think are crucial. If we go back to the 1970s, we're seeing today in the 2020s, the beginning of a lot of work on unequal exchange again. Our Gary Immanuel wrote Unequal Exchange probably in the late 60s, early 70s. It was published. And we're seeing the reappearance of, and this consolidation of unequal exchange, where benefits accrue to the imperialist countries of the West. We see a tremendous amount of dark value that Donald Cleland has pointed out, based on labor exploitation, which is not shown in the official, statistics that are provided by international organizations and so forth. Labor arbitrage and so forth. And I would also raise this point, controversial in the West, where I am, that there is, and there has always been a aristocracy of labor, which is in Western Europe and North America, and maybe some other areas, a few other areas, Australia, etc. And this growing evidence of inequality and poverty in the global South will stop the SDG goals from taking place in 2030, in part because of COVID-19, but I think it goes and extends far beyond that, and it extends to the development models that have been put forward by the major capitalist and multilateral agencies of the capitalists and the states that are running that form of capitalism. So, all in all, I think we really do need to go back to the work of Lenin, the work of Hobsbawm, and a number of, and Immanuel and Samir Amin, amongst others, and really investigate this and do deeper research, which I think is appearing almost as a cottage industry on unequal exchange, the transfer of value from the global south to the global north. With respect to migration, I want to put forward, and this also relates to war to some degree, the rising levels of xenophobia, where, I don't need to say much about it. Yesterday or the day before yesterday, 94 workers in South Africa, just outside of Johannesburg, were arrested. Most of them were Malawian workers, and there were also Zimbabwean workers who were arrested. And these arrests, I think, are taking place primarily because of xenophobia and the state's efforts to gain some form of legitimacy. So let's take a look at migration very briefly. I just want to put it in context. There are 250 million international migrants that exist. If we think of this just in a kind of moderate fashion, they have families, so that maybe there would be 4 people for every person. So 250 multiplied by 4 is 1 billion people. Internal migration, there are 800 million conservatively in places like India, etc., and throughout a number of countries, Africa, which would bring us to 3.2 billion. And if you add that up, that's more than half the population of the world that has some kind of effect or is affected in some way by migration from rural areas, low-wage migration, temporary migration, sometimes official, sometimes undocumented, and so forth, migrant workers living in abysmal conditions, something that we really need to discuss, and I'm sure the papers that will be presented will as well. One of the great ironies of this is that the global north and the Western countries are in great need of migrant workers in construction, manufacturing, in agriculture, in home care, and a whole host of industries. And yet they are treated as if they are less subhuman. So that's one very important point. And also they're not able to develop countries. So this is the last example of the failure of the neoliberal capitalist model in terms of development. This is their latest example, and it's been a great disaster. Just to get one of the points that was going to be discussed in the papers, I want to end this on an optimistic note if I can, and that is the idea of resistance and the idea of confronting the global capitalist system is crucial. I see on the whole a decline of social movements, although there are some very good examples of social movements around the world, in Latin America, Southeast Asia, etc., Africa, and we should, make them stronger. I see the Chinese example as being one that is emblematic and perhaps a model for the other regions of the world, where, I guess this may be controversial. I do see socialisms in one region, if not one country, in huge countries that are possible with their own kinds of perspectives, different forms of socialism existing in Southern and Central Africa, in Latin America, the pink tide, in East Asia, in North Africa, etc., the Sahel, and one can go further. So, those are the examples I gave. So I think that this may be the way of the future. I think it's the most hopeful possibility that we have for any kind of future form of socialism. And so I take great, I hope with respect to the Chinese model that is emerging. We don't know what's going to happen with respect to it. The prosperity program, etc., seems to be a positive development. So I won't end it on a negative note, but I just want to say that the Western Marxists that we have are really destructive to any form of socialism. It goes back to the aristocracy of labor theory. They are mainly interested in developing their own countries through the extraction of wealth. They're not interested in increasing the prosperity amongst the poor, the absolute poor, as well as the countries that are going through great forms of poverty. And so I think there's a lot to discuss with respect to that issue. One example was the most recent book, The Imperial Mode of Living by Ulrich Brand and Marcus Wiesen. It's just an example that that we are living off of the exploitation of people in the third world. But I do see hope, and I think my time is just about up because I want to keep time. And thank you for the invitation, and I will try to be there in Harare next January. I promise. I really promise. Thank you.
Isa, you're on mute.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Immanuel. I said that I also hope to see you in person in 2024 in Harare. And one of the points that you made sounds so ironical, and yet capitalist system is full of such ironies that you have this whole lot of people. You said 250 million international migrants who are exposed to inhuman conditions and exploitation, and yet their remittances are now being held up, okay, as a great source of revenue for the poor countries, to the extent there is a whole movement in many African countries for the so-called dual citizenship, to take advantage of the remittances. So this is where the contradiction lies. And yet these people are remitting, actually exposed to very severe conditions in the host countries, including, of course, xenophobia, not only in South Africa, but even in the global north. Whole right-wing and fascist parties are really thriving on this. Thank you very much, Immanuel. I think Praveen and Immanuel have raised some very important issues that I hope we will be able to sum up. Let me now to talk about China. Let's go to Sitsui, and you can give us a good idea of whether China can be a model and whether Immanuel's optimism is justified. Thank you. Please, welcome.
Yeah. Thank you. And I start from an interview with Sami Amin in 2018. And in May 2018, we interviewed Sami Amin. He mentioned that we are in the stage of senile capitalism, and this kind of capitalism is declining, but it needs systematically more and more violence. The collective imperialism refer to triad, that means US, Europe, and Japan, has understood that it cannot manage the world except using more and more violence. This is also one of the symptoms of the decline of a system. And in his book, The Long Revolution of the Global South Toward a New Anti-Imperialist International, Amin divides the contemporary period of the history that he experienced into three distinct periods. And he mentioned that the beginning of the capitalist imperialist system's implosion in 1995, and the parallel beginning of renewed struggles for another better world, particularly in the new global south. That means we can find the implosion or the dark side of senile capitalism, but at the same time, we also find the possibilities. So I give you some example from the Chinese perspective. In 2013, it was a year that for US realignment, excluding China and other peripheral countries, from a global financial alliance. In October 2013, the US Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, and the central banks of the United Kingdom, Japan, Canada, and Switzerland came to a long-term currency swap agreement to replace temporary mutual liquidity swap agreements. Given the construction of US dollar liquidity, the monopoly of the 6 central banks dominates the polarization of the world monetary, financial, and economic system. In this way, the monetary system of the West in the financial globalization era forms a pattern similar to that revealed in Wallerstein's wealth system theory, core, semi-periphery, and periphery. In other words, the US dollar remains in the central position together with the currencies that orbit around it, the euro, British pound, yen, Canadian dollar, and Swiss francs, forms the core monetary system. However, there's already changes not only in geopolitics, but also the politics of currency. For example, since the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, and now China pay the Russian coal and oil in yuan, in renminbi. And also now China and Russia has more interaction, particularly in many projects, particularly also in the projects in the Far East. And there are projects in industry, agriculture, construction, transport, and logistics. And it's a total of 2,760 projects with a total investment of 107.6 billion US dollar. This is in Far East. So you find that this is a kind of reordering of the US-led monetary global system. It is also a existing practice of de-dollarization. And we find that Lula also proposed a unitary Latin America currency. It's also a kind of, maybe a kind of a legacy, or continue to carry on the legacy of the Bank of the South. So we should learn from the lesson of the Bank of the South, why it failed. And is this a possibility to create a new currency that is benefit for the Latin America? And another challenge is from, of course, ecological crisis. We are encountering the climate crisis, but I will say that climate collapse. And we all know that Amazon has long been known as the lung of planet. However, it's no longer the case because the region forests produce more than 1 billion tons of CO2 a year, which means that they now emit more carbon than they absorb. So this is a really real challenge, not only for the indigenous people in the Amazon in Brazil, but also for us. So how can we encountering this climate collapse and strengthening the indigenous struggle, not only in Brazil? And Lula also proposed a kind of forest alliance. That means Brazil, Indonesia, and Congo. But of course, this is in terms of state level. How about at the grassroots level? How can we facilitate is a forest alliance at the among the popular movement? And moreover, we also have to face the unsolved nuclear disaster since the outbreak of the Fukushima disaster. So we are not only talk about land struggle, but also ocean struggle. Why I say that? Because this coming spring or summer, the Japanese government will release more than 1 million tons of nuclear wastewater into ocean. And then it definitely affect the fishing communities and countries, of course, not only in East Asia, but for the whole world. So I think how can we strengthen also the struggle for the fishing communities, not only the farming communities. And in China, because of pandemic, we have a new policy emphasize the importance of rural revitalization, because we will face a new wave of unemployment, and because we no longer will be the world factory, and this is not also not our solution for us too. So how can we make the policy of rural revitalization in practice is our challenges. Although we still have the gains of land revolution of 1949, because our lands is still controlled in the city, controlled by the state, but in the rural area is controlled by the village committees. That means we still have the collective ownership of the land. And our bank, often not only the land, but also the bank is controlled by the state and also party. And also the we have the collective ownership of the land and also the property at the village level. So this is our struggle. We have to maintain and not defend the small peasantry and village committees, and also defend the rural communities. This is our majority. And during the pandemic, and also we still in pandemic, not post-pandemic, because since China abandoned the zero policy, zero COVID policy, and now we are facing of course the problems. However, it is also a struggle of how to struggle with the Western medicine capital, because based on the past 3 years, we use a lot. We use largely TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, and we have very good effect. And this is have good effect, and this is cheap because the whole course is only cost, the treatment only cost you $15 US. But now the because in the national healthcare, the insurance, it covers not only the Chinese medicine, but also the Western medicine, and is the Pfizer to try to ask for very high price quotation, because now is for the price Paxlovid is around the cost is the around $340 US, and now Chinese government try to cut the price to $105 US, and say no to this kind of high price. That means they try to struggle with the pricing of the medicine. But I want to add one point: why we have to portray such high price and actually not so effective medicine? We have very good Chinese traditional medicine. It's cheap and effective. So that means we also struggle with the big pharmaceutical company. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sitsui. Very important points you are making about that. Not only we are involved in land struggle now, but ocean struggle and the forest struggle to address the questions of climate. So all round collapse we are witnessing, but at the same time, we must an all-round struggle for the working people, whether these are fishing communities or forest communities. So I think that also sums up the kind of struggles. And the last point that you're making about traditional medicine and how to take on the devastating effect of the pharmaceutical industry, really, on the health of the world people. Okay, because pharmaceutical industry has a devastating effect, the kind of medicines they are producing. Not inexpensive, but who knows whether they're effective. So thank you very much, Sid. We have now the last speaker, Paris. Please, I hope that you can now bring these points together.
Thank you all for being with us. It is really a great honor to have you, and a great pleasure to be back here in Harare for our summer school. These roundtable sessions are important sessions because they give content and direction to the main theme, which this year is popular movements in urban class struggles in urban and rural peripheries. So we can engage in a conversation about this and that movement, but if we don't have the full picture, we tend to not see the forest and the whole range of problems that the movements have to confront. So this session has served this purpose. I will just add a bit of perspective, add a bit of historical context, and what perhaps lies ahead. We are indeed, as Praveen said, in a very long crisis since the 1960s in the centers. Crisis in terms of profits falling since the mid 60s in the productive sectors. This trend has oscillated up and down, but generally it's been a long-term decline of profits in the productive sectors, and they have only been recuperated through financial profits. Yeah, the new data that's coming out is has been systematically reinforcing this point. We are, in fact, it has also been said that this is just a cycle, another crisis of capitalism. Somehow will come through it. It will not. Now, this is this permanent crisis. Is the terminal crisis of capitalism. This is what it looks like. This is what the rest of our lives will go through it, and our children and grandchildren. This is a long, long transition. Yeah, there's no new cycle. Yeah, it's a long and messy transition to socialism. It is also important to point out that this crisis did not simply operate on some abstract law. There were struggles that forced monopoly capitalism to adjust, and especially not only the socialist experiences, but also the general decolonization that occurred in the 50s and 60s of the last century. This was a major change in the relational forces. Never had capitalism, after 450 years, had to confront sovereign states, even small, weak sovereign states around the world. So it marks a real problem for the operation of capitalism. This from that point onwards, in fact, it coincides with the onset of permanent crisis in the 60s. Nonetheless, it's not the rupture. The system stays in a polarized mode of accumulation between North and South. And it is, in fact, what Kwame Nkrumah called a neocolonial order. It's different than a colonial order, but it remains the aftermath, and it remains a system of polarized accumulation. This neocolonial system is the baseline of the international relations of this new period. It's a center of gravity. You can contest it. You can rebel against it, you can protect yourself from it, but the pressure is on, yeah? And it forces all states in the South to take a position, yeah, on how they will deal with this new system. Some states fell straight into line after decolonization. They went straight into a neocolonial situation. This was the majority of states. Some states confronted this neocolonial order in the spirit of Bandung with a quite radical nationalism, policy of non-alignment. Other states like China effectively delinked for a long 20, 30 years. There was an effective delinking from the system. And there were other states that didn't actually decolonize in this period, and those were the settler colonial states. And there are several, yeah, not only in Southern Africa, yeah, like Zimbabwe in that period, South Africa, but also in Latin America. Yeah? Brazil also did not have a universal suffrage until the 1980s, the end of the 1980s. And it remained, like other Latin American states, with variations in a settler colonial mode until this last phase. Now, so we have a variety of situations confronting this order or succumbing to it. This last phase that Praveen and others have been talking about is the phase of the rise of finance capital. This also is what we have called the late phase of neocolonialism. Yeah, it's not something that Kwame Nkrumah was able to look ahead and foresee, but in fact, neocolonialism has gone into a late phase under finance capital, yeah, which has resubordinated the South, with the exception of China, especially, but some others. But it has resubordinated all small peripheral states, semi-peripheral states, all fell into line. By the 90s, India, Brazil, which made its own neocolonial transition at this time with universal suffrage, they all fell into line, yeah, in this new order. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was also a major factor in the change of the relational forces. And it is important to grasp some of the tendencies, because we pay so much attention to the emerging states and so forth, but actually some other things have happened. Yeah, we try to capture this in a book called Reclaiming the Nation about 10 years ago in 2011. There has been a series of small states that have radicalized. Yeah. If you look at Zimbabwe in this period from the 2000s onwards, Venezuela, Bolivia, they went into a new mode, which is a Bandung type of mode. There were also states that went through convulsions, but they were restabilized under this system for another few years until the next convulsion. And there were many states that fractured or were occupied. In fact, in this late phase of neocolonialism, we can distinguish between two further tendencies. One is a return to a type of semi-colonial situation under that the neocolonial baseline. Yeah? These are the states that have been occupied. We're talking about many states, large swathes of territories in the western part of Asia, in the Sahel, in Latin America, in Haiti, yeah? States that have been occupied, yeah, physically, or have fractured and occupied. And this is a real reality, because even if they are a dozen, they have enormous effects on whole regions. We saw this with the invasion of Libya, how it has destabilized the whole region. The other aspect of this is the rise of neo-fascist forces across the South. They have characteristics of their own, these tendencies. They're not a mere replay of previous experiences, but they're very real. So in Brazil, in India, we have had, this is a real tendency. In this period of this phase of late neocolonialism. Underlying this is what Praveen has also been emphasizing, that this is the period of the massive growth of labor reserves. And this is a systemic element which undermines the exercise of sovereignty. The growth of labor reserves is a crucible of all kinds of deleterious tendencies that have pointed out. So where is this going? The question of changing the center of gravity, changing this baseline, this neocolonialist baseline is called various names. It's called multipolarity. It's a funny term. It's not actually. It's actually a term that it's become. It's established itself. It's immovable. But Samir Amin preferred polycentrism. That was his preferred term. Yeah. Multipolarity is a term that comes from U.S. American political science, in fact, and it meant for them just a balance of forces among militarized states which compete against each other for world domination and so forth. But that's not exactly what we have in mind, of course. Now, we're stuck with the word multipolarity, but we have to give it our own meaning. And the meaning is what Samir Amin had given to it, which was a polycentric world where the delinking occurs in various regions in national and regional arenas, such that an introverted process of accumulation can occur, which is socially oriented and can radically change the history of the last 500 years. It requires, as has already been said, de-dollarization. These are some of the key systemic provisions for this to happen. New financial circuits, and in fact, China, Russia, and others are stitching together an alternative financial and monetary system with pegged possibly to oil and other commodities. So we are seeing, in a systemic sense, a subversion, of the basics of the neocolonial order. But it is important to recall that when we speak of delinking, for it to be worth its name, it has to be able to absorb effectively these massive labor reserves which exist in across the South. I will just give you a quick numbers from the ILO, which numbers we have used. There is a massive difference between North and South in terms of employment, salaried employment, secure salaried employment. In the imperialist centers, prior to the pandemic, the proletariat consisted of approximately 86% of the working age population. This was followed by 78% in Central and Eastern Europe, 65% in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in North Africa, as well as 21% in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So on the top, you have above 80% of the population is a proletarianized society. At the bottom, only 20%. So this is a different type of social formation. This type of delinking, therefore, and I'm trying to conclude, Isa, delinking cannot remain neither at the level of a multipolarity notion that is either reduced to what the U.S. political science anyway has always done, but even from a more progressive perspective, it needs to be very focused on how to absorb these labor reserves in this century, in fact, in the next generation. This is an urgent matter, because otherwise we are talking about genocide on the agenda. This is a systemic genocide which is on the table in the 21st century. I wanted to speak a bit about Brazil, but maybe we can pick that up in the discussion. I think I will just stop here, Isa.
Thank you very much, Paris. Thank you very much, Paris. Thank you very much for
You're on mute.
keeping in time, which leaves us 40 minutes for discussion. Now, I think you've got a number of points which are made, and our discussion can be constructed around that. So polarized accumulation, impoverished working people, impoverished masses, and illegitimate political power, increasingly using violence and force, increasingly using coercion rather than consent. Okay. And this has taken various forms in various countries like neo-fascism, right-wing, various kinds of phobias, and ethnic and religious populisms. So that is where we are at, and we are witnessing overall crisis. And Paris says that this probably would be a terminal crisis for capitalism. Of course, it won't happen tomorrow or day after tomorrow, but it is a terminal crisis for capitalism. And one of the main indicators of a terminal crisis that now capitalism, to be able to rescue itself, indulges in massive destruction. But this time around, destruction will not be followed by reconstruction, but it could be followed actually by devastation of the human race as a whole. So that's where we are. But let's always keep in mind that number of speakers have ended in an optimistic note. And I think that is the resistance of the people. What you logically conclude does not necessarily happen historically because of the resistance of the people, because of the human agency. Now we have, I think, about 40 minutes for discussion. At 4, we will conclude this session. So may I invite participants to make their comments, please. Yes. We have 8 Q&A. Shall we start with questions or? No, I don't see any questions as such. Let us start with those who are present in person. Do you have any comments or questions?
Yeah, the Q&A, I think it was before when there was a problem. But we have, we don't have on the Zoom or on the live stream any questions. We can check. Can we check? Someone's raised a hand. Oh, okay, very good. Frank Rowley, please.
I see there's hands up. Frank Rowley. You'd like to speak? Frank Rowley, unmute yourself, please.
Unmute yourself.
Frank.
Yeah, maybe.
I can see his hand up, but he probably cannot hear us.
Let's canvass the group here. Yes, we have. I will help. Yes. No, the microphone is not working very well. It's better to come. Yeah. So Boa Mojane has a comment or a question. So given that we have had trouble with the microphone, we'll speak straight into the.
Boa, please. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think the panel was very powerful. Both Sid and Paris mentioned, violence and the rise of fascist forces, but none of you mentioned the word authoritarianism. And I wonder if, is it fascism, and how can we understand also the new developments in terms of rising of authoritarian and populist politics in the last period. But none of you neither used the word or mentioned the word democracy. Why is it so? Are you suggesting that a democracy is also in crisis, or is something that we should forget about and maybe propose other forms of popular participation in the fight against global capitalism? Thanks.
Thank you. You almost answered your own question. Is democracy in crisis? Can we suggest alternative forms of participation rather than the liberal democracy that we are used to? Yes. Shall we take some questions and then go back to the panel? Right?
This was a bomb.
Yeah. Any more questions then before we go back to the panel?
Who
Paris,
else
can you
would like to make a? Please,
Paris, can you
please,
help?
Immanuel can go first.
Yeah, Manny, you can call me.
We have.
Okay.
No, please go.
Oh, yeah, I think that Jade made a very compelling case for democracy in China with respect to these village communities that are having a number of discussions about policies, and the return to the rural areas is creating higher levels of democracy. So I would argue that, in fact, democracy was discussed by Jade in a very profound way in the rural areas. And I think that this is something that I think Roland Bohr has written about, and a number of other scholars, that there's a very high level of participation, and that's what Jade's pointed out as well, amongst these various communities. So that's what I would say. And, you know, with respect to democracy, I think the West is a charade with respect, you know, in terms of democracy. We have one-party states for all intents and purposes. You know, certainly in the United States. And there is really very little room for debate whatsoever, even with respect to this war that's going on. If one were to, I dare I say, argue that NATO, this is a proxy war that NATO is fighting, you know, you risk your job, your life, or something like that. So, you know, I think that we should discuss the notion of authoritarianism, and the reason why, in fact, the West is so interested in advancing authoritarianism through military coups and so forth, and destabilizing countries. So I would say authoritarianism is something that is coming from the West.
Okay. Okay, so now I think the point that Immanuel is making, that Sid Sui talked about community participation at the village level, and maybe there's something there to learn from, although I think the details, of course, we'll have to read about. On the question of authoritarianism, I think this was very much in discussion in the 60s and 70s. But my own personal feeling is that what we're witnessing now is more than authoritarianism, really. I'm seeing all kinds of almost fascist tendencies rather than simply authoritarianism. Yes, we have a question from Ruth. Ruth, nice to see you there.
Nice to see you. Thanks so much. It's strange to be talking into the computer, but I'm also posing a question to the people next to me. I think that it's very useful the way that you framed crisis within crisis. And one of the things on the concept of polycrisis for me suggests also that the ways in which crises unfold are compounding, and that the levers available to capital to respond are changing, are foreclosed as crises compound. So if we think about the responses to the 2007 to 2009 and the kinds of responses that were feasible then, that may not be possible now. I'm thinking about the financial crisis, subprime, etc. That the ways in which those states are able to respond are not the same as what was available 15 years ago. And one of the implications of this surely is that the costs of current crises are being borne to a degree that we haven't seen before by working classes and working people in the North. And for me, that suggests the possibilities of political reconfigurations and alliances. And I'd love to hear all of your responses to that. I was struck, Immanuel, by what seemed to me to be a fairly pessimistic reading about the potential of social movements in the current moment. Perhaps that's a reading of what we see in terms of perhaps the older traditional mass movements in some parts of the global south. But I wonder where you would see the potential for such reconfiguration, opening the space for new forms of alliance, new dimensions of such alliance across parts of North and South and across parts of the South, alongside possibilities for delinking and the politics of delinking. So Sit and Paris were both referring to the possibilities for currency shifts being driven from above, by states, by China, by Russia, by others potentially, and that being a potential reconditioning for the space for forms of development outside of a neoliberal globalized format. But that seems a very top-down vision of an unfolding of change. And I wonder how you would see that potential for top-down, but also for its articulation with movements and new alliances from below. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, who would like to go on that? While there are some initiatives coming from the top, but it also creates spaces.
So we have one more.
From the bottom up. Yes.
We have
there
3
is?
more hands raised here. So please.
Okay, let's take those 3 hands and then can come back to
thank
the panel.
Okay. Yeah. So first is Archa.
Okay,
Yes.
so thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Go on.
Thank you for the very interesting interventions, and I have a couple of simple questions to ask. As we know, that terminal crisis, the impending and the persistent crisis of capitalism also intensifies the non-antagonistic contradictions within the result. And in order to basically carry out a successful transition, which we've been talking about, if the objective conditions are ripe for a successful transition out of capitalism, then what is the mechanism for that? Because that transition can only be carried out by the unity of the working people. I don't think that that transition will be carried out top down. So my question is, that is the transition possible without social transformation? And if it is not possible without social transformation, then what is the mechanism of that transformation? Because that transformation is not going to come from the state. The state is becoming much more conservative and intensifying the non-antagonistic contradictions within the working people. So what is going to be the organizational and strategic mechanism? Because social movements is a very wide category, and it's a... So what is going to be, and how are we going to theorize it? In the olden days, people theorized the party, people theorized organization of various types. So what are we going to sort of push as a way that resolves these contradictions in order to ensure that this objective condition is transformed into a more egalitarian and socialist world? I don't think that we have the answers to this right now. So these are my questions to you.
Yes, I think if I understood Archana's question, she's saying that the crisis is also intensifying, and sometimes deliberately so, the non-antagonistic contradiction among the working people. Not only working people of the South, but working people both of the South and the North. And how do you address these non-antagonist contradictions to make sure that you transit the way we would like to transit? Thank you. Sandeep?
Hey, and thanks for that excellent panel. I will continue what Archana was saying. And I was wondering, when we are talking of the crisis and the continued and the multiple crises and crisis within crisis, how are we looking at the social organizations question, the social movements question? What seemed to come out from the panel, and I agree with Ruth, was a fairly pessimistic, what Immanuel was saying particularly, that, and I, somewhat even I think so, that, it seems like the civic action, the civil society per se, the social movements, at least the traditional ones, the popular ones, are probably way down, and there seems to be a weakened response, and maybe the new forms that you were alluding to, Ruth, or the different forms of organizations that will be different form of organization that was alluded to, maybe a way forward. But I think it needs some more further critical thinking and examination, particularly with reference to the popular political projects, the popular political instruments, the instruments of political parties per se. I think that's something we need to talk a little bit more, discuss a little bit more, and I'd like to put this to the panel here. And secondly, the rise of neo-nationalism or new forms of nationalism, which concurs in a different way. And I think that needs examination alongside the other issues of ethno-religious nationalism and ethno-religious card that is being used. These are the two things I'd like the panel to reflect a bit further on. In the context of the crisis, in the context of where we see the next trajectories to be and what should be our take to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep. Thank you, Sandeep. Again, very important question on the question of organizational forms, although it is somewhat concrete question, but I think the question that is being raised, can we have the audacity to go beyond social movements in terms of organization of the people? And how do we learn from the actually existing organizations, the way people organize themselves? And what do we learn from that? Thank you. I think now we have the last question.
Yes.
If we go to the panel.
Yes.
Yes,
yeah.
please.
So the name is Tatenda, Prof. The name is Tatenda. Can you hear me clearly? So mine is
Okay.
it's not a question. It's more of a comment, and I think when talking about perspectives of the world capitalist crisis, and I want to reiterate the point that Paris has made, that it's terminal. And I think it's terminal because as an economic system, capitalism commodifies. This process of commodification is, I think, the reason why it always has a terminal crisis. And I want to speak to the point of this idea of the commodification of human beings and how that is sort of been generating crises, over time. And to bring it to the contemporary period, there's this concept that is now being talked about surveillance capitalism, and how that is contributing also to the commodification of humans. This idea of commodifying personal data so that we predict and shape, human behavior, and how these issues speak to the undermining of human autonomy and democracy itself. So of course, the Brexit vote, the coming in of Trump, all that, and how people's voting patterns were sort of shaped and influenced by surveillance capitalism. I just think those discussions, we should just keep them on the back of our minds when talking about any perspectives on the world capitalist crisis. And of course, there are also new social movements that are already beginning to emerge to confront that particular characteristic of that particular character of capitalism. So yeah, it's just a comment just to bring that to the fore, because of course there have been many other crises that have been talked about: the ecological crisis, unemployment crisis, debt crisis, and all that. But of course, this current one is something that we must also keep on the back of our minds. Yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So we have now exactly 20 minutes left. And I think we can have response from each panelist for 5 minutes, not exceeding 5 minutes. And I'll start from the last speaker on I'll change the order. So can we start with Sit Sui? And one of the things I would personally like the panelists to respond to, we have talked about lots of crises, multiple dimensions of the crisis, all over. But how do you crystallize? What is, as Lenin would have asked, where is the weak link for the working people? Where is the weak link? What is the weak link and where is it located at this particular conjuncture? So let's start with Sit Sui.
Yeah. I would like to respond to the question about the currency, particularly because I also heard a lot of experience about the community currency, and it is calculated with the neighbor and time. So this is also initiative from people, particularly in crisis. So I think we have different experience in history too. So how can we recognize this kind of people initiative? And also during the 1950-60, actually we don't have so-called the renminbi. We have only the coupon, the food coupon, and also the work pawn, 工分. At that time, there's no so-called the money. And how can we have to mobilize people to do the farm work and work in the factory, or to have a normal daily life? That means if you work, you have food. So I think we have to reread the historical experience about what does currency mean, and also when we talk about community currency, and I mean, how can we have a value system that is benefit for the majority? And for example, TCM, the traditional Chinese medicine, has thousands of years, and why it still exists at the grassroots, at least at the grassroots level, and is still struggling because it's trying to challenge the logic of capital. It means profit making. It means it's only for the elite. And you know that the Western medicine just asks you to eat more medicine, because in the philosophy of TCM, it means to completely cure the so-called the sickness or the illness. Completely cure. Complete is a complete treatment. That means you don't need to have more medicine. And sometimes it's also free, because in some nowadays, during the pandemic, we also have some cases that means that many donate the Chinese medicine for the whole villages. It's free. And I don't think it's not only in China. In in Brazil too, the MST also have the food donation. So I think when we talk about currency, we can also to challenge our the mind, only the focus on the cash. That is why, how can we through currency to challenge the value system? As money may be only the not an exploitative tool, but how can it turn it into a mediator and help us to challenge or change the value system, the capitalist value system, and democracy. And I also want to emphasize that when we talk democracy, we should relate the question to how can we has access to land, right? To the living, how can we improve our living condition and our relation with the human beings and with the society and also with the nature. So I want to enrich the discussion about the democracy and not just the voting, Western style voting system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Next, let's move to Paris. 5 minutes, please.
Yes, you can hear me? Yes? Yes, okay. Thanks again. We'll have to combine some questions and try to answer the best I can, because there was really a lot on the table. Now, the question of democracy and versus authoritarianism. Now, this dichotomy has a history, and it has quite some heavy, European philosophers behind it, like Hannah Arendt. Yeah, but at the end of the day, it's a type of pulverization of the context in which democracy develops. Yeah? I started off putting the focus on neo-colonial democracy. See, it's not an abstract. It has to be, democracy has its context. And it's not something we can just use as a stick against our enemies, let's say, as it is commonly done. There is a problem today with democracy. I think we have spoken quite quickly on these issues, but I recall just a month ago we had Professor Attilio Boron in one of our anniversary lectures, the 20th anniversary lecture, and his notion of the changes, his idea, he explained the changes in Latin America in terms of democracy. There is a media monopoly that is completely out of control. Yeah, so the ideological apparatus is almost out of control. They can form minds and opinions at will. Yeah, so that's out of control. The judiciaries are out of control. Yeah, the militaries are out of control. So where is the democracy? I mean, you have a voting system and so forth. Even the coups these days that happen seem to observe, certain constitutional rules, So these things need to be contextualized. And I should add that here in Africa, the debate in that early phase of neocolonialism was about neocolonialism. In the late phase, even our grammar changed. It became democracy versus authoritarianism. We imported a grammar that was not exactly driven by domestic agendas. So now there is just the other question that I just quickly, having said that, universal suffrage is a victory of the South against imperialism. Yeah, I have no doubt about that. Yeah, and this is a very recent phenomenon. It's only 50, 60, 70 years old. Universal suffrage is what the people of the South conquered through their struggles. So that needs to be respected. Yeah. The other question about top-down. Yeah, like others, I spoke a bit about some of the systemic determinants of the dollar, the financial circuits, and the notions of polycentrism or multipolarity, which need to be interrogated further so that they really gain meaning. But that's the point, is that even if we get shifts in substantial shifts in the monetary financial system, it is not guaranteed that the delinking that will happen will serve the internal needs of the social formations of the South. You see, and so there's no external. The point is, there's no external savior. Yeah, I say this because in Africa, a few years ago, when there was a huge protest movement spreading from country to country in Latin America. People were looking to Latin America for hope, but Latin America was looking to China for hope. Yeah, so everyone's looking somewhere else for hope. Yeah, but no, the hope is here. Yeah, we cannot search for an external savior. Yeah, so yeah, I think I would just stop there.
Thank you, Paris. Thank you, Paris. Immanuel?
Thank you. I agree that there are many questions on the table, and I'd like to commend everybody who's participating in this very important conference and summer school. I thought it was very interesting that Isa brought up the point delinking, because it was on my mind as well. As we were discussing the week, the week he brought up the weak link, and we we're talking about delinking. And so maybe there's some kind of connection between the two. Lenin discussed the weak link, and Russia was the weak link within the global financial system, where the exploitation of labor was at its highest level in the early 20th century. So from a perspective of finance, capital, and so forth, Russia was the weak link. We could actually, perhaps if we did some extensive study, we could have a discussion about, where the weak link is in the world today. I would say it would be someplace like India, maybe Brazil or someplace like that, a very large country that has a certain degree of development that does not have a comprador class necessarily, or is not run by a comprador class. Those are the weak links that the international capitalist class requires. So I think there's a connection between the two, and I thought it was very interesting that Isa brought that up. As far as my pessimism, I'm actually not a pessimist, I'm a realist. And so I'm an optimist. So I have very great hope that there will be transformation. I don't believe in, I don't think we should be having too much hubris about certain types of new form of organization and so forth. Small organization is not something that is going to contribute to a total transformation of a country or a society. And so I think that I do believe in the significance of the state and the region and a people. And I think that is actually an anti-imperialist perspective, as opposed to one that looks at the world as equivalent, and capital can go wherever it wants. But I think that, for instance, if a people of Southern Africa want to join into a regional group, it would be extremely powerful, to fight the mining companies, extremely powerful. I'd also like to point to the World Inequality Report, which I know, it's run by a number of people out of Paris, but it's pretty, I think, authoritative. The numbers of the inequality in this world, even the IMF is discussing it as one of the major problems of the world. It has to end. And when we talk about sustainable development goals in 2030, they're not going to be achieved. And it's not just because of COVID, it's because of the fact that many of the countries are declining throughout the world. I mean, take a look at the Sahel and how countries like Burkina Faso, can barely control their own boundaries and so forth. But I mean, I don't know the precise numbers. I could come up, I have them. Just take a look at the World Inequality Report. I think 1/10% of humanity owns something like 20% of the wealth, and 20% of humanity controls 80% or 90%. We have a very big problem, and I think that's related to imperialism, economic imperialism, which I think needs to be addressed to a significant case. And I also think, and I agree with Paris and Praveen, as well as Jade and Isa, the notion of labor is crucial. Precarious labor is significant. It's primarily a global South phenomenon. Labor unions have declined dramatically throughout the world, in the North and the South. The Southern labor unions are primarily products of the West. in many instances, although there are a number of communist unions that emerged. But I think that it's significant for trade unions to be far more strong in struggling against the state and international power. I know my time is up. There's so much more to say, and I am only just touching on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manuel. Okay, Praveen.
Thank you, comrades, chair and all panelists, and of course, to all interventions from the floor. Very, very profound, very important. I don't think we have easy answers to some of these, or rather most of these, right? And we need a lot more time to get into a richer deliberation. So hopefully, during the week, those who are present here, we can have more conversations on those issues. Okay, authoritarianism, democracy, etc. All, in any case, I mean, binarism of any kind is no good, right? So you have varieties of capitalism, you have varieties of authoritarianism, right? Varieties of democracy, right? Some democracies come very close to authoritarianism. No, the way it kind of gets a few points are picked up, and so for instance, the US is a democracy. I mean, once you start unpacking it, I think Immanuel put it very well that this whole war vis-a-vis with NATO, vis-a-vis sort of Russia, and what Paris was talking about, basically peripheralization of the periphery. In that, US is centrally implicated. So what kind of democracy is that? People use these things maybe as, just to start the conversation. As you said, universal suffrage and so on, fine. But we really need to unpack all this, and this context and so on and so forth are extremely important. And in that sense, just one number, Stiglitz tells you, the richest country in the world, the 1957 remains flat.
Lost.
Authoritarianism of capital vis-a-vis labor, right? We need to then get into all those issues and so on and so forth. So, polycrisis and foreclosing of several levers that we have, indeed, sort of things have changed. The point is, what kind of new levers can we create? And all these are questions relating to strategy, political sort of how to create conducive political situations and so on. And there are millions of, I'm putting Nepal, millions of mutinies all over. Problem is they never connect. No, this is what Nepal had said in 1950s. India is a country of million mutinies. This was the precise thing which he said. How do they connect? How can we create possibilities for those connections? So these are, exceedingly difficult questions. I think to claim easy answers would actually be running away from. Let's stop.
Thank you very much, Praveen. Thank you very much. I think it's a very interesting panel, and we can talk more about weak link, Immanuel. Why not Congo? Maybe we'll have several weak links in each area. And the Congo I mentioned precisely because its compradorial class is not well formed, and you have masses of people who are almost marginalized. Okay, I would suggest, I hope Freedom is listening to us, and since this is being recorded, it could be transcribed, edited well, and can become our next article for purpose of debate in our bulletin. Because I think very many interesting points have been raised here, and I think we need to continue debating them. You see, because end of the summer school is not the end of our debates. And the question is how to keep this debate sustained. And the only way to do it, in my view, would be for this to be transcribed, edited well, and published in the bulletin, inviting debates and comments. Once again, thank you very much. This is an extremely fruitful roundtable. I think it has established a context for the summer school, and I hope to meet you again very soon, even before 2024 summer school. and keep well and keep struggling. Never lose hope. Hope is our only weapon. That's why we exist. We exist in hope.